Welcome to Ask the Doctor, where we get the experts to answer your most curious questions about health. I'm Sarah Maattanen, and I'm glad to be your host as we discuss an issue that is related to what's sweet, but its effect is sour. Diabetes is a major problem in our world today, but is it possible to reverse type 1, type 2, and even type 3 diabetes? Well, to answer this question and others, we are joined by the renowned lifestyle medicine physician, Dr. Chidi. Dr. Chidi, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. But before we discuss what may be wrong with us, let's find out what's right with you and what is the most amazing thing to you about the human body.
Well, first of all, hello, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with you all. Well, that's a big question. What's the most fascinating thing about the human body? I would say the way that all the systems interconnect with each other. There are very complicated systems in the body, the nervous system, the immune system, the cardiovascular system, to name but a few. But the wonderful thing is that they all interconnect, and they're all happening without us even thinking about it. So, our breathing, our eating, our digestion, everything that's happening without us even having to have control over it. So I would say that's at the top of the list, and it just proves to us just how fearfully and wonderfully we are made.
Wonderful. All right, Dr. Chidi, we've heard that you've had major success in treating diabetes. However, you were trained as a surgeon at places like Cambridge and Johns Hopkins. So what was the aha moment that led you to swap the surgeon's knife for lifestyle medicine?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was pretty early on in my training. When I was up at Cambridge, you have to do a sort of a basic surgical rotation. And I was doing that at Cambridge. It's a wonderful, prestigious place, as you all know. Only 6 people get to go onto the surgical rotation in Cambridge per year. So I was very blessed and privileged to be there. But something was happening. I already had a couple of restaurants that were going on in London. They were called Plant. They were plant-based restaurants. One was a fast food takeaway. The other was a la carte restaurant. And when I was spending my days up in Cambridge, I was getting messages from London saying, there are people leaving messages for you saying that they need less medication for their blood pressure or their diabetes since they've been coming to your restaurant. And they're only coming to your restaurant 2 or 3 times a week. I thought, oh, that's interesting. Then sadly, my father died of complications of diabetes. So that was a big shock to my system. And then number 3 was when I was in clinic. So I was being taught in cardiothoracic surgery, that is how to do heart bypasses. And I was sitting in clinic with one of my professors, and a gentleman came in the door, and he wanted to have another bypass. He had one before that had kind of failed. Now he needed another one. Now, my professor, who was sitting next to me, said to him, look, you are too sick. There's nothing we can do for you. Now, this is Cambridge. I mean, this is the most brilliant surgeons around. And he was told that there was nothing that could be done for him. And so we let that man walk out of the door. I think within a few months, that man had passed away. And I started to think to myself, hold on, this doesn't make sense. With all this knowledge, with all this training, we're letting people die. Seems to me needlessly. And it was linking with what was going on in my restaurant. Well, maybe there's something we can do with our diet that can help us to overcome these diseases. So then I decided to investigate for myself what was going on. First of all, I started off with heart disease. I came over to the States, and I learned at the feet of people like Dean Ornish and Esselstyn, Caldwell, realizing you can reverse heart disease. And I thought, well, I wonder if we could do this for diabetes. So I then introduced a program that could help reverse diabetes. And really, that was the start of everything.
We know that cases of diabetes are skyrocketing globally, but given your success, please give us your perspective of what diabetes is and its various iterations.
Yes, so it's good to understand what diabetes is. I mean, really, to sum it up, we have about 50 trillion cells in our body. All of them need glucose to generate energy to survive. Now, glucose doesn't just pass directly into the cell. What has to happen is that the cell needs to be attached to a molecule of insulin. The insulin then opens up the cell for glucose to pass in. That's in a normal functioning body. Now, if over 10, 20, 30, 40 years, your cells have been exposed to a lot of insulin because it needs to let a lot of glucose in. If you've got a lot of sugar in your system, drinking sweet drinks, eating fast and fatty food, that means that your cells are constantly going to be interrupted by insulin. So eventually the cells start to say, you know what, I don't want to accept insulin anymore. And the cells become insulin resistant. And therefore the sugar doesn't get into the cells, it stays outside of the cells, and then it rises in the bloodstream. And sugar is terrible for our system. So if you have lots of sugar in your bloodstream, it causes all sorts of problems. It narrows the arteries, it thickens the arteries, it leads to heart disease and all sorts of problems. And so that is why we get what we call insulin resistance, and then the body doesn't work properly. So that's kind of a background of type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is slightly different. Instead of your body producing lots of insulin, which the cells become resistant to, you don't make enough insulin. Insulin is made in the pancreas, and if the pancreas is destroyed in any way, and in children, it's usually destroyed by some sort of an autoimmune disease. That's where the antibodies that are supposed to be protecting us start to destroy parts of our own body. And in children, it starts to destroy the pancreas. The pancreas can then not make as much insulin, and therefore you can't open up the cells to glucose for a different reason. And so blood sugar starts to rise. And so if you can, and we'll talk about it, if you can prevent or reverse the autoimmune problem, that patient can be free as well, because type 2 and type 1 diabetes can be reversible. Type 3 diabetes we call dementia type 3 diabetes, and everybody knows and fears dementia, and pretty much we say that that is a function of too much sugar in the system. It is a metabolic disease. That is actually good news rather than bad, because it tells us that just like all the others, it can be stopped and it can be reversed.
Wonderful. That is so hopeful. I love hearing you say that type 1 and type 2 are reversible, and I guess we're going to hear more about that when we talk. We hear so much about sugar, but I've heard you mention that the real culprit is often insulin resistance, driven by more than just the sweets on our plate. Can you break that down for us?
Yes, well, obviously, sugar does cause insulin to be released, but there are other reasons why insulin resistance occurs. So, apart from sugar, there's fat. Now, fat does not need insulin to get into the cell, but obviously, fat is concentrated energy. So, if fat can pass directly into the cell, giving the cell lots of energy, well, that cell then doesn't need an awful lot of glucose. Okay, so then it makes the cell even more insulin resistant. So we don't need any more energy. We don't need any sugar coming in. So the sugar stays on the outside and builds up. Another reason for insulin resistance is the good old stress hormone cortisol. Anybody who's had any treatment with steroids knows that, first of all, you want to eat an awful lot, and then you have the risk of becoming type 2 diabetic. We make our own steroid, cortisol, with stress. So the more stress, or let me put it this way, not so much the more stress, but the way that we are unable to deal with stress, which causes our cortisol levels to go sky high, can cause insulin resistance too. And finally, because there are really four things that cause insulin resistance, finally, it is the amino acids and the proteins in meat that can trigger your cells to become more insulin resistant. The more meat products you take, the higher your risk of becoming insulin resistant.
Okay, so that was high fat, high sugar, high
Stress
stress, and
and
protein.
a lot of meat. Yeah.
Yes, okay, meat protein. So you're a big advocate for the whole foods plant-based diet.
Yes.
Is it true that fiber specifically acts as a weapon against high blood sugar? And if so, how?
Yeah, fiber is vital. I mean, when you think about the difference, for example, between an orange and orange juice, uh, most of us can eat maybe one or two oranges in a go. Very few of us can eat 7 oranges on the trot. But if you have a little glass of orange juice, that's about 7 oranges worth of juice. So it's quite easy to get down. No fiber in the juice, just the juice with the sugar. So that amount of sugar is so much that it's just about the same as a Coca-Cola. So the reason why we are designed to eat oranges is because they are full of fiber, and that fiber slows down the absorption of sugar into our system. Along with the sugar go the minerals, the vitamins, the actual starch and fiber, all of those good things that are good for the body at the same time. It's not just concentrated down for sugar. So that is why having lots of fiber in the system is fantastic for you. In fact, it reduces the risk of any diabetes. In fact, over nearly 100 years ago, when Dr. Himsworth was traveling the globe looking at the diets of different societies, he realized that the Japanese had lots of carbohydrates in their diet, but very little diabetes. And the carbohydrates were not the chocolates and biscuits and cakes that we have. The carbohydrates were just the natural fruits and vegetables and beans that we are supposed to eat, full of fiber. Even though it may have sugar in, it still protects us from diabetes. It's a bit of a myth that fruit causes diabetes. It does not. It's full of very good ingredients that actually lower our risk of type 2 diabetes.
Wonderful. And that's good news.
Very good.
Dr. Chidi, you have a unique approach called Life Colors. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, sure. So Life Colors really came to being because I tried to boil down what are the major lifestyle diseases that are affecting people and killing people. And it came to 9 different diseases. And I gave each of those 9 a color scheme, right? And so, for example, there's high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, stress, depression, autoimmunity, cancer, and dementia. So these are just some of the biggest killers. And most diseases come under these umbrellas. Most lifestyle diseases come under these umbrellas. We call them lifestyle diseases because it's our lifestyle that gets us into them. And thankfully, it's our lifestyle that can get us out of them. Now, each disease I give a color. Diabetes is purple. You might ask, well, are these random colors? Not really. Purple sits between red and blue. Blue represents obesity, red represents heart disease. If you have a lifestyle where you are obese or you have heart disease, the chances are you're going to be diabetic too. If you really want to reverse obesity and heart disease, if you have diabetes as well, if you hit diabetes, you will reverse the other two. And so that's how it came to be. And so Life Colors is just a simple step-by-step way of getting people to reverse their disease. Well, first of all, stop the disease, reverse it, and then also get them off the medication. And it's a system for each disease which involves the 3 elements of reversing disease. And for me, it's the meals, the movement, and the mindset. And once you get those 3 things on track, the disease goes naturally.
Can you elaborate on those 3, meals, movement, and mindset for our viewers?
Yes, yes, of course. Well, meals comes first, and as I've mentioned before, I promote a healthy, plant-based, whole food diet. Now, look, there are other schemes out there. And by the way, I've been doing this for over 25 years. And when I first started it, people thought, well, I was a bit of a quack. It's not possible. You can't reverse disease like this. Obviously, we've proved them all wrong. Now, there are other people who use other techniques. Some of them use heavy meat diets, for example. That's something to talk about. But for me, if you're going to go on any kind of health program, what is good for one area of the body must be good for all the other areas of the body. There's no point in treating somebody for diabetes and curing them only to build up the risk of cancer down the line. So what's good for diabetes, will also be good for cancer, would also be good for obesity and heart disease and so forth. And so, yes, a healthy plant-based diet. And I am blessed because it's a miracle of God that I actually ended up being married to a woman who produces some of the best healthy, tasty plant-based food. And she has her own website. It's called Plant-Based Sis, plant as in sister, Plant-Based Sis. So that sort of food, which is beautiful, colourful, healthy, full of all the things that we need, is vital as a basis for reversing disease. So that's the meals, and I recommend that to you. The movement is essential, and it's essential for every lifestyle disease that we have. We were designed to move. You know, movement produces life, and life produces movement. That's what I say. And so, but movement can be quite simple. It could be just walking each day, doing a little bit of resistance exercise, stretching, holding positions in certain ways. All of these things use up the muscles, stretch the muscles, and use our heart to increase our metabolism, reduce our weight, and get rid of a lot of the sugar in the system. For example, for diabetes, the key is as soon as you've finished eating, you go out for a walk. When you do that, you are using the big muscles in the system, and the big muscles will absorb glucose very rapidly. In fact, the big muscles don't really need insulin to absorb glucose. So you've eaten some food, even if it's healthy, as it's being digested, sugar will be passed out into the system, into the blood. And so your muscles, whilst you're walking, will be absorbing that glucose. Therefore, you don't need as much insulin in the system. Therefore, your cells can become more insulin sensitive again. And obviously, mindset. Mindset is key, because what we must learn to do is to cope with whatever stresses we have in our system. We can't avoid stress, but we need to learn how to live with it without it killing us. When we go through a stressful situation, if our cortisol levels keep going up, well, that increases our risk of many, many diseases. So it's a mindset, learning how to forgive, learning how to let go, learning how to be gentle and kind. Many of those fruits of the spirit, really, they are really leading you to a happy and healthy life.
What can you tell us about fats? Few have discussed the issue, but how does that figure into reversing diabetes?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, fat passes directly into the cells, doesn't need any insulin to enter a cell. So the more fat in your system, the greater the insulin resistance will be, because if your cell is acquiring lots of fat, it doesn't need as much sugar because it's already got lots of energy to break down. So what we have to do is obviously reduce the amount of fat in our system. That means consuming less fat, burning up more fat. And the more you do that, the lower your insulin resistance, the lower your risk of type 2 diabetes. Now, you know, when people talk about fat also, it's not just this subcutaneous fat that we can see when we see somebody who looks obese, that obviously they have a lot of fat. But there's also this hidden fat that even slim people can have. We call it visceral fat, and that's the fat that cloaks our internal organs like our heart and our kidneys and our liver. That is actually more dangerous than the subcutaneous fat. That fat is the one that leads to things like cancer and heart disease and diabetes, much more than the subcutaneous fat that we see. So even if we are relatively slim, we have to deal not so much with the weight issue, but more with the fat issue. And that fat issue, if it's not addressed, can lead to all sorts of metabolic illnesses.
People mention that not all fats are created equal. Can you speak to that for us? Is there a good fat, bad fat?
Yeah, I think the thing people have to understand is, first of all, fat is fat. It's concentrated energy. Okay, so even if you're having the good stuff, it's still concentrated energy. So if you have too much of it, it can lead to problems. But as people say, there are certain fats that are much worse than others. So you have the monosaturated fats, things like olive oil. You know, that's some of the best fats that we can have. Then you have the saturated fats, usually found in animal fat, and sometimes in coconut or coconut fat. Absolutely. But those saturated fats, let me take coconut oil out of it, but the saturated fats that are from the animal, those tend to be a lot worse for our heart. So monounsaturated, saturated, and then you have what we call the trans fats. Now, this is a different type of trans issue. The trans fats are the ones that you will find in the shops that keep the shelf life of the foods like cakes and biscuits long, but they decrease our own shelf life. In fact, in many parts of North America, trans fats are actually banned, which is a wonderful thing. I remember the last time I was in California, you couldn't find a trans fat in California. So that's wonderful because they are absolutely lethal to our arteries and our heart. So that would be the hierarchy of fats that I would suggest.
From your experience, is there an anecdote or story that you could share about someone's journey in reversing diabetes that you've seen firsthand?
Yes, I think there's a story I have that always comes to mind that is both good and bad because it was a couple, a mother and daughter, who came to me wanting to reverse their diabetes and their blood pressure at the same time. And I think a few weeks in, the daughter, for some reason, wanted to pull out. I think maybe she didn't feel she had enough money to do it. So she pulled out and said, "Well, look, Dr. Chidi, I'm just going to pull out and I'll come back in a few months." I said, "Okay, no problem. That's how it is." Her mother continued. So her mother became free of diabetes and free of blood pressure. She did very well. But within, I think, about 2 months, the daughter had a major
Oh,
stroke. And yeah, she was bedridden for at least a year and a half. So she really couldn't do much at all. So it was her mother who had to look after her. And for me, the cautionary tale was, first of all, I've never, I'm pretty accurate in this. I've never been unable to reverse diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Once people do A, B, and C, they usually reverse their type 2 diabetes. But when people say, well, I'm just going to put it off, you are really risking your own health.
mhm.
What you have to do is do everything you can. I mean, I put myself in their position. I would do everything I can to get rid of this disease more than anything else in my life. Because the longer you have it, the higher risks of all the complications. And as I said, my father was a classic example to me. He died way too early from the complications of diabetes.
Dr. Chidi, what are the complications that result from diabetes, and what would you recommend for someone who's dealing with those issues?
Well, there are many complications. So, as I say, everywhere in the body you have cells. Anywhere that there are cells, they can become insulin resistant. So, if your arteries are starting to narrow, your blood pressure goes up, you start to lose your sight, feeling numbness in your hands, things like erectile dysfunction for men, depression, all of these, your skin starts to age an awful lot quicker. Your whole body starts to age a lot quicker because you're not getting enough blood and you've got too much sugar in your system. Your kidneys will start to be damaged. In fact, the three ways that we kill our kidneys is too much sugar, too much blood pressure, and too much animal protein. So every area of your body will be affected when you're having pre-diabetes and even especially type 2 diabetes. So it is something that needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. And I cannot overemphasize how important it is.
Thank you. I've heard that it's common for pregnant women to experience gestational diabetes, but is that normal? And is it possible to go through pregnancy avoiding that diagnosis?
I mean, the majority of women do not get gestational diabetes, which is just what we call a transient level of diabetes whilst they're in pregnancy, and then usually it goes away when the baby is born. But for women who do get this diabetes, it means that their blood sugars are not that great to begin with. And even though they come out of it at the end, it means that they are predisposed to getting diabetes later on. But I guess what would be more important to the mother is that while she is going through this period of gestational diabetes, the child in utero is at risk, right? And so we know that there's a higher risk of genetic malformations and structural malformations in the fetus whilst going through the gestational diabetes. So if we can eliminate even the gestational diabetes, you decrease any risk of any harm happening to the unborn child.
Those three pillars that you mentioned earlier, are those going to be the basics for a pregnant woman to manage her gestational diabetes?
Absolutely. Yeah. Meals, movement, and mindset. It's always the way. Um, Better to get into that program before the pregnancy. In fact, I can tell you, even when people are trying to get pregnant, things like infertility, which is often a function of autoimmunity and stuff like that. I do counsel people and train people on how they can remove these barriers so that they can get fertile again. But I'm just saying that in that before pregnancy comes, it's better to get involved with the proper meals, movement, and mindset so that the pregnancy can be a lot easier. It's a lot more difficult when you're trying to introduce it in the middle of the pregnancy.
How do you view diabetes treatment looking 20 years from now? Will things change? Will the conventional approach likely change?
Well, from 20 years ago until now, there were just a handful of people like me who were helping people to reverse diabetes. Um, with a little bit of help, we are trying to promote this globally so that people understand that nobody has to live with type 2 diabetes. So once we get the message out, there are very few people who would say, no, 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 I prefer to live with my diabetes and take my medication for the rest of my life. Um, I am hoping and I believe that more and more people, as I see it, I've just come back from Holland and off to Nigeria at the end of this month. Every country I go to, this message is really accepted with an awful lot of enthusiasm. So I believe in 20 years' time, more and more people will be doing it. Also because, the health system to treat type 2 diabetes is very expensive. And even governments globally are finding it, even here in Britain, we're finding it very expensive to treat so many diabetics. And the number of diabetics is going up exponentially. So all those people who are in the governments who need some help in lowering your costs of healthcare, come and see me.
Dr. Chidi, thank you so much for bringing hope to this conversation. It's been incredible having you.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
If you've enjoyed this week's episode of Ask the Doctor, please join us for the next episode as the conversations are still going. Please submit your questions to askthedoctor@3abn.ca or call 250-298-6148 and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.